So in the New Testament, we have various letters, and among the New Testament are occasions where we have multiple letters exchanged between the author or the writing community and a particular audience. So we call that correspondence. And so in this session, we will look at the correspondence between Paul and the Christians in Thessalonica or Thessaloniki, depending on where you're from. So pulling up our PowerPoint to guide us in this, let's see what we can discover here. So let's remind ourselves of what we mean by the early Jesus communities, because that's what we're talking about when we talk about the believers in Thessaloniki. So remember that we looked at the Christians as one large social network in those early days, that they had different communities in different places, such as Jerusalem with its leaders. We found them also in Palestine, in Syria, just at Antioch. We found them in Turkey, which was Asia Minor. Then we found them in part of what we know as Macedonia. That's Europe, and further west, all the way over to Rome. And of course, on the islands, such as Crete, where Titus writes to. And, we should certainly recognize that not every community had a particular leader. Sometimes those were itinerant leaders, like people who would travel around. And we were talking about missionaries and local pastors. And so we recognize various communities as we are provided a window into this world in the New Testament by way of their writings, such as Peter and his community, and James and his co-leaders, and then John and his community in Asia Minor, and then a variety of groups that are implied by us learning about Lydia and Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos. And then at this time, we're going to look at some of these communities that we have a window into by way of the writings of Paul and his friends and his co-workers. So that's what we're talking about. And, we're used to correspondence, right? Silly text messages and social media and snail mail and things like that. And, sometimes we get so caught up in it, as you see in this meme, that we don't even know that we're holding the device that we're looking for. So the Thessalonian correspondence, here's an older picture of the city of Thessalonica over in Greece. And you see that in the very center of the city, we find ancient remains. So you can see the little remains of a theater, you see some Roman pillars. And that is exactly correct. I mean, these remains represent that this was a hustling and bustling, very much so alive town or city, if you will, at the time. And we learn about what happened and how Paul first got in touch with this community by way of the text that we got through Luke. Luke writes about this in his book of Acts to Theophilus, where he talks about him and his travel buddies, such as Silas, and then later on we learned that Timothy is with him too, traveling that area. It says that after Paul and Silas had passed through some other places like Amphipolis and Apollonia, that they come to Thessalonica. It's kind of like at the upper part of where the Aegean Sea comes in. And it says there was a synagogue of the Jews. And so Paul always went in there first. He was from Jewish descent and he could just kind of connect with people. He also still maintained his Jewish practices, right? And then it says that on the next 3 Sabbaths, so 3 weeks, he talked to them from the scriptures, which would be the Hebrew scrolls and books, and talking about the restorer who would come, the Messiah, and that it was necessary that he would suffer. And that's the way that Luke describes that, right? And so he quotes from that. So some of these Jewish people said, yes, that fits our narrative. And others say, we are just not having this. These outsiders that come in with new interpretations. And look, they're even persuading people from around us. Look at verse 4, like Greeks and some leading women. So it says the Jews became jealous, and by Jews we mean the leaders in the religious components of Judaism, not necessarily Jews as an ethnic group. Okay, and so it becomes rough. I mean, there's some interaction there where they go in the house, where they stay. and it's uncomfortable. We see as we continue to read the story that it kind of becomes hot. And so the believers in verse 10, the Christians there, the Jesus followers, they say to Paul and Silas, y'all should go probably. And they sent them off to Berea, another town. And they continue the practice of going to the Jewish synagogue, hoping for a different outcome. And sure enough, in verse 11, those Jewish leaders and those Jewish believers are more receptive than those in Thessalonica. And so they perceive Paul's interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. And so they're checking, like, what's up with his interpretation of the narrative? And so many of them believe as well. Well, when the people at Thessalonica hear that in verse 13, they come and they chase him down, and they come to the synagogue and they cause a stir up. And so then those believers as well say, keep going, Paul, keep going. And so he makes his way over to the coast. And since after this, he ends up in Athens, that means he's going over to the Aegean Sea, kind of like a little in cove from the Mediterranean. But Silas and Timothy, other Christian leaders, they kind of stay behind with those people. So it gives us kind of an idea to the backdrop of this correspondence. We have two letters in the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and we date that somewhere around the year 50. Now, some scholars debate that. At some point, you got to take a stance, right? Somewhere there, with Paul as writer. Now, if you remember the whole thing about disputed and undisputed, there's some that reject one of the letters as being Pauline. We know it's written to Thessalonica, and by the time that he writes to the believers there, he has made it all the way to Corinth, which is also in Macedonia in Greece. And this letter has a very specific theme because he's answering one of their questions, the questions of the believers. And Paul had apparently been teaching a new concept. He had talked about that Jesus would come again. Jesus first came as a baby. We celebrated at Christmas as believers. But Jesus also said, I'm going to go and prepare a room for y'all. I prepare a place for believers to dwell, and then I'll come back. And he wasn't just talking in the present tense, as you would find that in the movie that portrayed the Gospel of John. He really meant that also overall in the scheme of history. So Jesus is coming back, and we call that parousia. And that's really just a Greek word for coming and going, and he is coming. But in the Christian vocabulary, that has become a name for an event when Jesus returned. And Paul had talked about that, had been teaching about that to the believers. And they're kind of confused about, so when is this going to happen? And how does it relate to how we live our life? So that's the theme of this correspondence. And so he's clearing up some misunderstandings. For one, after Paul left, some believers had died. And so people are like, well, we thought that Jesus was going to come back. He's preparing a room. He's coming back. And now some people did they miss out? And so that's kind of confusing. So let's get a feel for where Thessalonica is. So you have the big sea, the Mediterranean Sea here. Over here is Turkey. And then you have kind of like this cove here. It's rather big. There's the cross there between Europe and Asia. And then out here in this corner, there's Thessalonica. Okay, so you see they fled to Berea. There's Philippi here on the way and the Ignatian way. And then all the way down here, he gets basically to Corinth. And that's where he writes the correspondence. Sometimes there's more that we can learn from correspondence and from letters. So we can learn about the content, and we certainly can. And we will learn as we go forward here how to read letters. But I want to make some previous observations as well and just use this as kind of a test text. For example, it's written in a different language. So how do we learn about how to go about languages? It's written in Greek. So very interestingly, we can do something with the text. So let's get a picture here for the documents themselves. When you read the content, we can kind of reconstruct the history behind it. So when we can date when this happens based on what we know from the book of Acts and what we know from the letter itself, the circumstances in the church, we can kind of deduct that the Jesus movement, the news of Jesus, reaches that area of the world less than 20 years after Jesus lived. We call it the gospel, the good news. And then from the first letter here, First Thessalonians, we kind of get this feeling that it came into being, that it was formulated because Paul visited there with Silvanus, also called Silas, and Timothy. But that's how that came into being. And you kind of get this tone of, people are just not welcome. It's kind of like a persecution motif, religious disfavor. And this is the first time, if this is one of those earlier letters, that we learn about this idea of parousia. Okay, so that's kind of like the context. You can deduce some of that, extract that from the content. But we also can learn some language lessons. So let's take another look. We can make observations from the text. So part one, let's look at the language. The blue letters off on the side here are abbreviations for translations. The top three, you can tell, are English translations. I have the first part of the verse on this slide, and when I go to the next slide, you see that the verse actually continues, or the sentence continues into a next verse. These abbreviations stand for somewhat popular English translations, like NRS, New Revised Standard Version. That's the one we use here at the school. MSG, the Message. It's kind of like a free-flowing text, a little easier to read. ESV, sometimes popular among young people, the English Standard Version. It's often available in free apps. And the GNT, well, you can tell by the way it's printed, that's actually a Greek New Testament. It's actually printed in the language in which this was documented. So look at that blue word then in the Greek, right? So this is a sentence here. It's just in the middle of that letter, more towards the end. Paul is kind of giving us guidance. How do you live in a pagan city, right? And he says, well, here's the will of God, your sanctification, which is kind of like this idea of you should be the Jesus kind of people, right? That you stay away from. And then there is a Greek word here in the blue, pi, we sometimes know from math, right? And this P-looking letter is actually an R. We call it the rho, so it has a rolling R. The V-looking letter is actually a nu. It actually has an N sound. And then these three vowels here, the iota here, the I, actually can have kind of like a J function, and then this has an S sound. So this sounds like phonetically porneas. Porneas. You hear the word here? Porneas. This is where we get the English term porn. I know it's unpleasant, but this is kind of like where we derive that group of words. Okay, so now let's see how different translations in the English language deal with that word porneas. As translators, people have to make decisions here, right? So at the very top, the people that translated it for the New Revised Standard Version says, okay, so let's translate it like this. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you all, it's actually y'all, that you all abstain from fornication. That's how these people translate the idea of porneas. In the Message, Peterson kind of in a fluid sort of way says, well, let's translate it like this. God wants you all to live a pure life. So keep yourselves from sexual promiscuity. That's how he translates porneas. And in the English Standard Version, it's more broadly. It says, this is the will of God, your sanctification, that y'all should abstain from sexual immorality. So here's the question, right, for you. Do you feel that these are like synonyms? They're kind of equal. Like, it doesn't really matter if you translate porneas as fornication, as sexual promiscuity, or sexual immorality. Do they all mean the exact same thing, or do they have slight nuances? Like you get a little bit of a different idea with one word versus the other. What is your take on that? So that's interesting, right? So for some people, they say, well, it's kind of like the same to me, and others say it's nuanced for me. And so translating is quite a responsible task. Well, there's a couple of things that you can do. Since you have correspondence, you can check the other letter and see if this word might be used there. And just kind of get a feel for how it's translated, how it's used in the context of a different letter. Or if the author, in this case, Paul, uses it in other letters that we also have, you can also check those texts. Or you can check, in addition to that, in other overall texts in the New Testament and in texts of that time outside the Bible. So we can get a feel for the language, right? Let's continue on here then with that kind of information. And I told you we would look at the rest of the verse. So continuing in a thought, the different translators say that each one of y'all know how to control your own body in holiness and honor. The Message says, learn to appreciate and give dignity to your body. And then the Revised Standard Version, a little bit of an older translation, says that each one of y'all know how to take a wife for himself in holiness and honor. Ooh, that is all a little bit different, is it not? Well, in Greek, we just kind of follow the text, and we see a word here in blue, skuios, skuios. And so apparently that word skuios is variably translated as either body or wife. Now, we can be kind of free thinkers here, but body and wife, yeah, it's not the same thing, right? You go, how did that happen? Well, different takes on translating. And then we can ask the question, well, can we go about it the same way? Can we look in the other letter, the other Thessalonian letter, to see how skuios is used there? Or maybe other letters of Paul? Or could we look in other parts of the New Testament where, you know, the writings are also in Greek? Or what can we do? So that we can kind of get a feel like what's the best way? Well, here's the kicker here. Sometimes a word only occurs once in the New Testament. It's not a very big book. We call it the hapax legomenon. And in that case, you have to make decisions as to how to translate it. Can they go outside the New Testament to see how it's used there? Yes, this is exactly what they did. So in some places, skuios is used in terms of body. In other places, it's used to describe a wife, a partner. So very interesting. And sometimes you just have to use the context, what's going on in there. So this gives you some examples of learning about language by looking at a text. Finally, in looking at the Thessalonian correspondence, I want to point out the importance of looking at cultural context. We looked a little bit at this when we studied the Gospels. And here's one of those examples once again. Okay, so let's look at this. This is at the end of the same chapter, right? This is chapter 4 in Thessalonians. Okay, so let's take a look at this particular passage here. This is often preached from, sometimes in terms of people who teach about end time studies, if you're familiar with the church world. And sometimes this is used at funerals, okay? So remember that the theme, kind of like the question being answered in this particular letter is about, well, Paul was teaching about, you know, a timeline, this idea of Jesus is coming back, not as a baby, but as fully divine. And then people said, whoa, this is really a problem because we don't understand. Can you clarify this? Because some people have passed away and we thought Jesus was going to come first, okay? So they're grieving because they're afraid that these people have missed out on an awesome event. So here's how Paul responds to that, right? He says, I do not want you all to be ignorant, brethren, sistren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, a euphemism for death, right? Lest you sorrow with others who have no hope. Okay? Like we have hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, just like that, God will bring with him those who have died and knew Jesus, those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say, notice the we, that That's Paul and Silas or Silvanus and Timothy and everybody else with him writing this letter. For this we say to you all by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the parousia, until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who are asleep. So don't you worry, it will be okay. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. They will by no means stay behind. They will go first. Then we, notice he says we, who are alive. Paul is actually expecting to be alive for this event. And so then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. That's Jesus and the ones who are rising first, right? And thus, he says, we shall always be with the Lord. And then notice these blue letters. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. These are words of comfort, not words to scare each other, not words of confusion. And so that's really the idea here. This is why we sometimes use these words at a funeral, because we comfort one another as Jesus followers, right? So sometimes in some church situations, especially in the south of America, if you go to a Bible church or certain Baptist churches or something, people look at this and they read them as if it hasn't happened yet, what he is talking about here, and as if Paul is writing about some future event that's kind of scary. But remember, Paul is teaching them to not be confused about what happened, and he says, give each other a word of comfort. Now in verse 17 it says, "Remain shall be caught up." And somewhere in the 16 and 1700s, some group of teachers, the Millerites and James Miller, they kind of got carried away with the way they were reading the text. And so we're going to learn a little bit later in the course about how to read the text, right? A little bit before that, a little bit earlier than that, there were some monks like Joachim a Fiore who said, "Hannah, I wonder if we can calculate when Jesus will return. When is a parousia happening?" And so they started to look at the Bible, to the overall narrative, and see if they could see some patterns. And they just came up with some overall time schemes to get a feel for when Jesus came back, but they couldn't quite do it. And then James Miller, who formed the group the Millerites, said, we can probably figure it out. And he went back and just did some work with like genealogies and kind of figuratively looked a little bit at some things. Believe it or not, came up with some numbers and figured out the exact year, the exact month, and the exact date on which Jesus would be part of that parousia, that return. He convinced a lot of people. And so he gathered all these people on some farmland, and they sat on this mountain and they waited for Jesus to return. I believe it was somewhere in the month of October. So people didn't plant crops for the next year. Some of them got rid of their houses, and they waited all night, and they were singing hymns, and they were waiting for the early morning hours. They were waiting for Jesus to return. Well, Jesus didn't come. You would think that's enough to convince people that this is just not the way it works, right? Well, he said, "Oh my goodness, I've forgotten something. I've forgotten to calculate in the year 0. That's also a year." So he said, everything has to shift a year. You would think at this point you lose followers, but some people are just great talkers, right? He actually gathered more people. So more people, an exact year later, sat in that same place. Well, you gathered it. No Jesus. So there was a great disillusionment. And then people remembered there's actually a recording in the Gospels where Jesus says, "No one knows the day nor the hour of that point of return. And we're not supposed to mess with it." So people kind of got that. Then years later, this guy John Darby said, so we're not supposed to calculate it, but what if you kind of work around that? You know how people always find a loophole, right? He said, what if you don't really calculate, but it's kind of like an unseen clock. You kind of look at events, and the moment you see some signs, then some invisible clock starts ticking. And he thought he found it in this passage. He said, look, it talks about those who remain shall be caught up together. And he was reading that in Latin, not in Greek. And he said this idea of rapturo, this idea of rapture is in there. And he called it a rapture moment. And thus the idea of rapture was born. If you didn't grow up in the church, you probably never heard of this. Or if you grew up in certain denominations, maybe not. But if you grew up in certain parts of evangelical and biblical Christianity down here in the South, this is a popular thing. They make movies of it. They write books about it. And it's all based on this guy thinking that he could tweak the system. And so he said, look, that means that there's actually a meeting in the air. It even says that we meet him in the clouds. Well, clouds is gas, right? He said, no, there's going to be a moment that Jesus comes, and notice he meets him in the air. So Jesus is going to come. He's not going to really come on earth. He's going to come kind of halfway, and believers are going to meet him in the air, and then they're gone. And it kind of happened suddenly, but now you can start counting. Well, in and of itself, this letter doesn't give you a lot of guidance beyond that. But people who teach that, including this guy that came up with it, John Darby, they simply take other parts of the New Testament and mix that in. They'll mix that in with parts from 1 Corinthians, the next part of Correspondence we will look at, and parts from the book of Revelation. The difficulty is they were never written at the same time. The book of Revelation is written like some 60 years later. So when this was written to the people of Thessaloniki who were confused about what this was all about, the letter of the Corinthians, and certainly the book from Revelation was not even written. So that whole generation, or maybe two generations, would remain confused. It just doesn't make sense, does it? They would add that to it, and they would stir it in the pot and come out with some time schemes. When I first became a Jesus follower, I was living in a different country. I was living in the Netherlands, my country of origin, right? And I was part of a church that was started by American missionaries, and they taught that kind of belief. And I remember they were really into calculating these times. And this was back in the 80s, right? And I was a young person. And I remember I was excited about becoming a Jesus follower, to know about Jesus, to get to know Jesus, to learn about the thing, to learn about the text. But then this teaching started about this parousia, and it became real scary because this is like the end of the Cold War and stuff was happening in the world, and these people would offer Bible studies. And I was very grateful for the things that taught me about life and Jesus and the Word. But whenever there was a Bible study on that, I would always come home and I would feel fearful because the rest of my family really didn't follow Jesus, and they were always talking about some will meet him in the air and everybody else stays behind, and it was going to be an apocalyptic world and people were dying, and there was no Holy Spirit, and it was really fearful. And you also never knew when it was going to happen, and you were always watching the news like, oh, everything is going to get dark and worse, and one day this is going to happen, and maybe we can calculate it. And there was also a villain in the mix. In these writings, they talk about the Antichrist, like a counterforce. And so we were always looking in the news to see who was the Antichrist. And before long, I realized one night I was riding my bike on the way back. That's the main transportation in the Netherlands. And I was riding my bike on the way back from a Bible study, and I realized I had lost that sense of joy and fulfillment of being a Jesus follower, and I was no longer looking forward to the things of Jesus. I was now looking for the things of the Antichrist and these time schemes, and I became a nervous sort of person instead of just being joyful and just not worrying about the future. And so I just kind of put all that aside. I had Bible study materials. I stopped by Trask and I just dumped it all in there. Because you see, this passage says in verse 18 that we are to comfort one another with these words. It doesn't say worry about the people around you. This is supposed to be exciting. Well, then what do you do with this passage? If it's not about parousia in the sense of some sort of end of the world rapture, then what is it? Well, this is where cultural context comes in, right? Word of comfort there. Notice that it says in 16 that the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout and the voice of an archangel. Like who shouts in that world, in the first century world? Well, the shouts when there are warring parties. There are shouts when in Macedonia, where we are, right? I showed you that map. When heralds of the Roman Empire would come in, they would be shouting, and the people in the marketplaces would listen. There'd be a proclamation of sorts, and so people would listen to that. Trumpet. Sometimes there would be a trumpet there to get the attention of the people. If this was meant for the people who would gather in the synagogue, they would also be aware of Jewish history, and in Judaism, in the Hebrew Bible, the stories about people sounding the trumpet of God in stories, and then God would act. And then notice this idea of meeting Jesus in the clouds, right? That book that I mentioned, the book of Revelation, written 60 years later, it also talks about that every eye will see him as we meet him in the clouds. Remember when we read the Gospels, that when Jesus is baptized, the heavens part, the clouds part, and when Jesus takes his closest disciples with him, go up a mountain, and his appearance changes, right? And he shines like he's divine. There are clouds present, right? And when Jesus, at the end of the Gospels, when he ascends back into the heavenly realm at the end of the Gospel of Luke and at the beginning of the book of Acts, it says that the people are gazing as he's taken up, and he's taken up, and as the clouds take him. Well, as a very kind of naturalist sort of person trained in the sciences, I'm thinking, well, either it was a cloudy day or there's a lot of gaseous formations up in the sky, but I'm pretty sure that there's not a bunch of meteorologists that are writing these passages. Rather, in the Roman world, where we have these clues of the pantheon, the Greco-Roman gods, it's the gods that travel on the clouds. Think Percy Jackson, where the gods travel on the clouds and throw lightning bolts. The only people that travel on clouds, the only beings that travel on clouds are the divine. And if you're familiar with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, remember, even there's signs. At the beginning of the story, God has his people travel through the wilderness, and during the day, his presence is known by the clouds, and God speaks out of the clouds, and God meets people through the clouds. So notice this, we will meet him in the air, in the clouds. The first time Jesus came, he came as a vulnerable little baby. But the next time he comes, when the parousia for sure happens, Thessalonians, you have not missed it. The next time that Jesus comes, he comes as fully divine. He comes, if you will, on the clouds, and every eye will see him. The people in the first century, in the cultural context, they will get it. It's a word of comfort. How cool is that?